From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead today, a look at pre-plant weed control ahead of seeding winter wheat. K-State's Sarah Lancaster will cover the herbicide options for burndown and residual control of broadleaf and grassy weeds, as evaluated in K-State's independent field trials. Then, from the latest Kansas Forest Service podcast, K-State's Thad Rhodes joins Cassie Wandersee to discuss tree plantings for wildlife habitat. They go over some of the principles of species selection and site evaluation for developing such habitat. And further on this week's K-State Horticulture segment, Cheryl Boyer announces the details of the upcoming Kansas Master Gardener online training. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Glad to have you tuned in for another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. As we ever so steadily now approach wheat planting time in Kansas, you producers are turning your thoughts to managing that new crop, of course. And one of the first considerations here would be how you'll deal with that weed growth on that ground ahead of seeding that new stand of wheat. Some thoughts on that right now from our guest, Sarah Lancaster, back with us. Sarah is the weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. So, Sarah, maybe we should start this way by talking about what you see as the objectives of pre-plant weed control for wheat.
Yeah, so, there's a couple of things going on there, Eric, when we talk about this idea of pre-plant weed control. So we've been talking some this summer about the value and the importance of controlling weeds after wheat in that wheat stubble and managing that weed seed bank and kind of this idea of a burn down herbicide application so that you can start clean. Okay, so that's objective number one, is this idea of a burn down so that we can start clean. And so as we move through our discussion today, I suspect we'll talk about some products that fit into that category of burning down. The other key objective that you're trying to accomplish with a pre-emergent herbicide is this idea of residual weed control. So that's something we talk about a ton in soybeans and corn production, not so much in wheat. So one of the advantages that wheat has over corn and soybeans is that it's a super competitive crop, right? It's drilled into or broadcast into these relatively dense stands, and it's just very competitive with weeds. So from an integrated weed management perspective, if we can do things to get that wheat crop up and going and growing well, it tends to compete pretty well with weeds. But, one of the things we might need to do to get that wheat crop growing well is to use pre-emergent herbicides to control some of those weeds and keep them out of the way so that wheat can get established.
So with those in mind, going about product selection, let's talk about burn down alternatives and what one needs to evaluate there when they select a herbicide.
When we talk about burn down alternatives, some things to think about obviously are going to be what's your target weed in the field and making sure you've selected products that are suitable for that target weed. So when we think about burn downs ahead of wheat, we often think about herbicides that are in that plant growth regulating or that group 4 types of herbicides. And so those are things like 2,4-D, dicamba, and fluroxapyr. So they tend to do a good job of control. Well, they don't tend to. They do do a good job of controlling broadleaf weeds. However, they have essentially no activity on grass weeds. Okay, so identifying those weeds that are out there is very important. One of the newer products to think about in that group 4 family is a product called Pixaro. It's a combination of fluroxapyr, which is starane, and haloxafen, which is Elevore. It's got a label that was new this last fall. You can use it either as a burn down, so immediately ahead of wheat planting, or you can use it post-emergence. So after that wheat is up to about that 2-leaf growth stage through the flag leaf growth stage. So that's an example of a plant growth regulating herbicide that folks might use. The other standby for that burn down is glyphosate. So a lot of these products can and actually are recommended to be mixed with glyphosate for controlling grassy weeds.
So that's what you need to think about there as far as burn down. The residual control aspect here, what beyond what you listed here for burn down control?
So a lot of the products that we think about that have residual activity, well, a lot of the products in general in wheat production are going to be those group 2 herbicides, those ALS inhibiting herbicides. So, there you're thinking about things like amber or finesse would be a very popular one to apply prior to planting to try to get some extended control. As you move out away from those group 2 herbicides, 2 other products to think about would be Sharpen, which is a group 14 herbicide, PPO inhibiting herbicide. And the other product to think about would be Zidua, which is a group 15 herbicide, similar to Dual or Warrant that you might also be familiar with. So one of the downsides of those 2 particular products, though, is that they have a requirement for rainfall in order to be activated. And so as you think about the time of year that we're in and rainfall patterns, that could become a concern for producers looking for that residual control from those 2 products.
But again, when concentrating on that residual control, any combinations of these might be advantageous as well, or will they get the job done singularly?
In general, when we're talking about weed management and herbicide stewardship, we're looking at combinations of products. So, there's products out there that are combinations, for example, of sulfonylurea products or, even, again, adding some glyphosate or some other products with these herbicides. Another example would be amber, which is an ALS inhibiting herbicide. And actually on that label, there's a requirement to use tank mix partners from a different herbicide group. And so, the biggest reason for thinking about that with those ALS inhibiting products is really just herbicide resistance management. Mm-hmm. So those herbicides are super susceptible to developing herbicide-resistant populations.
And that gets back to a general thought on stewardship that you're including in an article on this topic that you'll be putting out on the e-update newsletter soon. And that is when you're going about selecting pre-emergence treatments here, you need to think about avoiding repeated use of products from the same group or of the same type to discourage resistance.
That's right, Eric. One of the things about weed management and chemical weed management in wheat is that there are not a ton of chemical options, a ton of herbicide options. And so often those options have labels for multiple application timings. And so just being aware of what product you want to use when is very important, I think, for managing herbicide resistance.
And just generally, talking of timing of application, are there guidelines on knowing when to pull the trigger for optimum efficacy here? The labels may help, but any thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, so anytime we're talking about, particularly for post-emergent products, anytime we're talking about optimum efficacy, we're looking for actively growing weeds, so weeds that aren't stressed by, in this time of year, drought or high temperature. And we're looking for weeds that are appropriate sizes. So, that 3 to 4 inch size for a lot of weeds is about as big as you really want to go for reliable, high levels of control.
Otherwise, those can get away.
They get away in a hurry, Eric. A lot of things get applied higher than that, and we see a lot of weed control as a result that maybe isn't as good as it maybe could be.
Sarah, with any of these compounds, are there any restrictions or limitations in as far as planting intervals following application?
That's a good question, Eric. So particularly for those group 4 herbicides, they're great for those burn down applications, but you have to be careful of when you're going to plant your wheat. So for 2,4-D, the recommendation is actually related to rainfall and getting a sufficient rainfall and then having 10 to 14 days pass so that you can have breakdown of that herbicide dicamba. If you're going to use higher rates of dicamba, the recommendation there is actually to allow 45 days between application and planting. So there are some limitations there as far as how close to planting you can use some of those products. I say we've talked in other conversations about those ALS inhibiting herbicides and how they have a tendency to carry over to subsequent crops. Some of them have rotation intervals up to 24 months for some crops. So just being aware of those restrictions and what your future plans are is important.
And respective to the wheat upcoming, if you have a 45-day waiting interval, you may be bumping up against the optimum planting window for wheat very quickly. So something to think about right away, as a matter of fact.
Yes, absolutely.
One other item quickly before we let you go, Sarah, and this is something that you're hearing from producers about with some regularity, having to do with row crops out there now. Injury to those crops that producers are maybe thinking is herbicide injury. You want to maybe lend a word of caution to producers not to jump to a conclusion there.
Yeah, I've had a couple of things come through my inbox and my voicemail here this summer. Folks concerned about chlorosis in their soybeans and some other issues. So the leaf tissue turns yellow, but the veins stay green. So that can be confused, particularly with triazine herbicides like atrazine or metribuzin. Another disease that kind of has similar might be SDS, which can be kind of patchy in fields. So lots of things to think about when you're putting that puzzle together, from the pattern of the injury symptoms to when they appeared and what herbicides were applied in that field.
Once more, run any questions about that past your local extension agricultural agents. They'll help you get a proper interpretation on that crop injury and whether or not herbicide applications are involved there. Sarah, as always, we appreciate the input, and we'll catch up with you again quite soon.
Thanks, Eric.
She's a weed management specialist, K-State Research and Extension, and principally today talking about pre-emergence herbicide options ahead of that soon-to-be seeded winter wheat crop in Kansas. Sarah Lancaster along with us on this Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues, and now a look at another of the ways that the Kansas Forest Service here at Kansas State University provides practical and helpful assistance to you Kansas landowners, as taken up in the latest Kansas Forest Service podcast. The service staffs 8 district foresters stationed throughout the state, and those foresters stand ready to advise you landowners on tree resource management for a variety of purposes, including wildlife management, which was the central topic on this podcast, hosted by Communications Coordinator Cassie Wandersee, and one of those district foresters who's actually been working with Cassie in this respect, Thad Rhodes.
This is a fun podcast for me because you are the rural forester in my county where I live. So I think it was last fall you came out to the farm here, walked around with me, talked about a plan to manage the woodlands. And really that gave me a better idea as a fairly new employee at the time with the Forest Service as to what visiting with a rural forester is like. You know, I know we had a discussion about what some of my land management goals were at that time, but in your experience, what are some of those common goals of landowners?
Sure. So it does vary quite a bit depending on the landowner. People are trying to get some information about what they could or should do with their woodland resources, and even considering, what's going to happen when I hand it to the next generation. Is it going to be something that's better for them that they can take and manage from a conservation standpoint? And overwhelmingly, it seems like there is a lot of interest in wildlife-related habitat improvement. When it gets to be hunting season, people spend time in the woods while they're sitting in the tree stand looking around. They're thinking, I've got a lot of trees here. What can I do to make this a little bit better? And then lo and behold, I might get a call the next day or the next week or after season's over. So that does to be a strong interest consistently through my career.
Yeah. Well, and I know that's something we talked about out here on my place. I love to hunt, looking at deer and turkey hunting here in the area. But what other types of wildlife plantings might you provide advice or guidance on?
Sure. So that's a good question. A lot of it really comes down to the landowner's objectives. Is it game species, primarily the bigger game, like you mentioned, the deer and turkey? Is it more of a upland bird interest? From a recreational standpoint, maybe there's wildlife viewing or songbird interests. And even more and more over the past couple of years, you hear the pollinator emphasis. That's more or less in grass and forb type plantings, wildflower plantings, but also in shrub plantings, and I think opportunities with tree plantings as well. Thing to think about, with the different types of wildlife species, each animal per se is going to need a specific set of species that are better suited for their needs. And so there's going to be a lot of different habitat requirements depending on what you are trying to manage for. And, in certain areas that might be more trees, in certain areas that might be shrubs, or in certain areas grass and forbs or wildflowers, and specifically like your native grasses. So a lot of that comes down to, is it the food type you're trying to get more mass production out there, or are you looking at it from a bird standpoint, maybe trying to create habitat for the insects, cover perspective? Are you trying to look at planting additional trees and shrubs, or are you looking at taking advantage of what's there and even potentially cutting some of those plants out? When you start to look at the successional process that plants go through or land goes through without active management, it's going to become more of a wooded trend towards a wooded environment. So is that going to be beneficial for those species that you are wanting, or do you need to go in there and reset the clock to where it's at an earlier successional stage? So it varies quite a bit depending on what the landowner's interests are and what their property allows as well.
What are some of those other considerations for a landowner as they think about improving their property for wildlife?
Sure. So I think that the first thing they need to do is sit down and think about what their objectives are for these specific areas. And then once they have that in mind, what they're really trying to increase, if it's a wildlife, increase the habitat for, start to look at the site that they're on. There's going to be a lot of variation, whether it's creek bottom soils, hilltop soils, different locations. What site allows for what species choices? And then once you get that in mind, then start to look at your plant species that could or should be there. And then, from an improvement standpoint, the biggest thing I try to relay to people is to keep it manageable. A lot of times I go out and visit with people, it's because they really have an interest. They want to do something. And I don't want to be counterproductive by going out there and say, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. And at the end of the meeting, they're like, oh my gosh, there's not time in my whole life to do all of this.
Yeah.
It's to start small, do a little bit at once. And, this doesn't have to be done all in one setting. Like if it's a thinning project, you start out 1 year, you'd say, okay, I'm going to do this stretch right here. And get tired of that or wear yourself down, say that's enough, I'll move on to the next thing. Certain times a year are better for doing habitat improvement work. If you're deadening trees, opening areas up, that's probably going to be a fall and winter type job. If you're planting new material, probably spring and or fall plantings. And really with the planting side of it, it's more than just putting the trees in the ground. Let's try to think about what site preparation is necessary to make it a successful planting, how to suppress the existing competition long enough so the planted trees can perform well, ordering the plant material in a timely fashion so you get the choices that you want, and then really the maintenance aspect is at times overlooked. It takes a good 3 to 5 years often to get those plants off to the start and to lead to positive results. A lot of times people think, it's springtime, the weather's nice, I'm going to order some plants, I'm going to get them in the ground, and I'll have some good habitat. And the planting itself is usually the smallest part of a successful project. That planning, the site preparation, and especially the maintenance are key into making it a positive result of project.
Yeah, I remember that when we walked through the property here, how we walked through and segmented some things off here around the house. Because like I shared with you at that time, my grandpa, when he was still alive, bless the man, but he hated to cut down any trees. So the entire house is surrounded by trees. The creek is completely wooded. There's really not a lot of open space, a lot of overcrowding, a lot of shade tolerant species like that hackberry is everywhere. So after you left, I was like, man, I need to buy another chainsaw. There's some trees that need to start coming down. So I really appreciated being able to break down those kind of management goals and areas and think about, okay, what can I get done? And, a big thing that we talked about too is looking at species selection for potential plantings down the road, focusing on increasing diversity and what would be good for wildlife and for my goals. So how do you advise a landowner on species selection for the projects that they're interested in?
Sure. So first of all, trying to look at that site again. There's various resources that are out there. I mean, trying to see what soils are specifically on those portions of the property that you're interested in management. The USDA Web Soil Survey is a good online tool where you can go onto the website, scroll in or zoom in to your property and find out what specific soils are there. Usually from a planting standpoint, I'm looking at the drainage of the soils, how much clay is there, how much sand, what species are going to be tolerant of those sites, and even potentially the pH of the soil on certain species. But getting an idea of what the site will allow, looking around to see what native species are there. If Mother Nature has it growing well, there's probably a good chance that it's suited for that site. If you're looking at trying to get some young material up and growing, just to look around through the understory and see if there might be some young plants that can be opened up or released and do well. And then the other option from a species selection standpoint is trying to encourage that diversity, like you mentioned. If we get too many of one specific type of tree, you're always setting yourself up for potential failures as new insect or diseases come out. Usually they are species specific. So the more you can diversify, not only from a species composition standpoint, but from an age structure standpoint, a healthier, better long-term woodland or forest area.
District Forester Thad Rhodes of the Kansas Forest Service at K-State, talking with the service's Cassie Wandersee. That entire podcast covers this subject of wildlife habitat development in much more extensive detail. Hear it at kansasforests.org. Kansasforests, all one word, .org. And we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and next up for you today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. Well, it was not a question of if, but how much corn and soybean crop production estimates increased from the previous year in the latest USDA crop production report released yesterday. Here's a look from the USDA's Rod Bain.
Corn and soybean production estimates significantly up. Cotton and winter wheat production estimates down. The summary of USDA's August crop production reports based on conditions as of August 1st. The year-over-year forecast for corn indicate a record 15.3 billion bushels for this year's crop, up 12% from 2019. Likewise, soybean production from the previous year is forecasted to rise 25%. And while not a record production number at over 4.4 billion bushels, the 2020 crop is expected to have record yield, right now forecasted at 53.3 bushels per acre. Winter wheat production estimates were lowered 2% from the previous month, forecasted now at 1.2 billion bushels. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Zeroing in on the numbers for Kansas from that report yesterday. Again, these based on August the 1st conditions. Kansas 2020 corn production forecast at a record 822 million bushels. That would be up 3% from last year's production. This based on 5.75 million acres. That's down 4% from a year ago. The corn yield forecast at 143 bushels per acre, up 10 bushels from last year. Grain sorghum forecast at 237 million bushels, up 16% from last year on 2.55 million acres, up 6%, and the yield for grain sorghum forecast at a record 93 bushels per acre, up 8 bushels from last year. And Kansas soybean production is forecast at a record 242 million bushels, up 30% from last year on 5.25 million acres, up 17% on acreage from 2019, and the soybean yield forecast at 46 bushels per acre, up 4.5 bushels from last year. Other numbers, winter wheat production forecast at 294 million bushels, down 13% from last year's crop, the yield at 46 bushels per acre. And alfalfa hay production, just over 2 million tons forecast. That's down 20% from last year, and that's at 3.8 tons per acre figured. All other hay production, 4.18 million tons, up 10% from a year ago, with an expected yield at 1.9 tons per acre. The Kansas numbers from the USDA's crop production report posted yesterday, and of course we'll be taking that report up tomorrow as we talk about the grain markets with K-State's grain market economist Dan O'Brien right here. And China continues its purchases of U.S. commodities under the Phase 1 agreement signed between the U.S. and China to start the year. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow tells reporters the deal is, in his word, fine. Asked if deteriorating ties between the world's two largest economies on other fronts could result in the trade deal being thrown out the window, Kudlow said no. Despite the tensions between the two sides, Kudlow said that one area between the two countries that is fine right now is trade. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He are to meet via teleconference to assess the progress on the deal, reportedly this Saturday. Now for you, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, and standing by with that is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Shelby Behrens is joining us. She is from Michigan and is a senior in ag communications and journalism at Kansas State University, but also served as an intern with Kansas Soybeans this summer. And Shelby, a different internship, but I'm sure they kept you busy.
Yeah, they sure did. We had quite a few responsibilities this summer. One of the things that was probably one of my favorite things that we got to do this summer was go talk to farmers and do some interviews. Through those interviews, I was able to write a few articles to kind of communicate with our consumers about what actually goes on the farm.
Was that the focus of the articles that you wrote, was to really inform the consumer about what Kansas soybean farmer does?
Yes, that was my focus and goal. So those articles will be on the Kansas Farm Food Connection page. So that's kind of a consumer-focused platform that really focuses on talking to consumers about farming and what happens on the farm.
Is that one of the things that got you interested in having this internship?
Yes. So my goal was to find an internship where I could talk to consumers as well as farmers. And Kansas Soybean does a really great job of that. I just kind of wanted to bridge that communication gap between those two different parties and kind of what led me to my major in the first place.
In so many aspects, agriculture knows that that's one of the hardest things to do, is because the consumer wants to know where their food comes from, but yet having that farmer talk to the consumer too.
Right, exactly. So that's why I chose my major, and it's just a very exciting major to be in.
What would you like to do in the future as far as once you graduate from Kansas State?
After I graduate, I want to be in a position where I can kind of talk to consumers about agriculture, kind of build that relationship and share the stories of farmers, just to get the two parties talking, I guess. Every farmer has a story, so I want to be able to share that story with people.
Be it a Kansas soybean farmer or a farmer from your home state of Michigan, it really is a story that needs to be told.
Yes, definitely.
All right, Shelby, we're out of time, but I appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
That is Shelby Behrens from Michigan, will be a senior at Kansas State University, majoring in ag communications and journalism, and served as a Kansas soybean intern this summer. On this latest edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, it's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And cattle producers, one final reminder about that Kansas Livestock Association, Kansas State University Ranch Management Field Day later on today near Smith Center at W&S Ranch. That's just to the southeast of Smith Center. Select Sires John Herrick will discuss how genetics can be leveraged to increase the profitability of an operation. Mark Wood of the Kansas Farm Management Association on preparing and planning for challenging times. K-State's Justin Wagner on nutrition management steps to consider during the post-weaning stage. And from the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Kelsey Olson with an update on resources for Kansas farmers from the KDA. The field day starts this afternoon with registration at 3 o'clock, the free beef dinner at 6:45. To find the ranch, look for the directional signs along U.S. Highways 36 or 281. And hope that you can make this fine program coming up this afternoon. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, our weekly horticulture segment, and to fill you in on an educational opportunity for those of you interested in taking part in the Extension Master Gardener program locally. Joining us now is K-State Research and Extension Specialist in Nursery Crop Production and Marketing, Cheryl Boyer. Cheryl will be coordinating this next round of training for the Master Gardener program. We best let folks know exactly what that program is, Cheryl. It's been around for eons, but there may be folks yet unfamiliar with it.
That's true. This is a program that's been available nationally for years, and it's adopted locally at the state level and then even further locally at the county and district level. So it's managed in Kansas very much at the local level, so you can be connected with people in your area to work on things that are related to gardening and horticulture and to just learn about them. So I think a lot of people this year with the pandemic have been at home and there's been a surge in interest in gardening. We've offered quite a few resources in extension horticulture to help meet needs, educational needs for folks. This is sort of another offering. So traditionally, the Extension Master Gardener program is for folks who have an interest in horticulture. So basic training really tries to get you up to speed. And I call it horticultural whiplash because it's just a lot of information. We don't expect you to have the equivalent of a horticulture degree of any kind, but it does give you a really good round opening perspective so that you can turn around and engage with your extension office by volunteering. So a lot of the questions that come into county offices are horticulture. And if they're lucky, they might have one horticulture agent, or it might not be anybody with that full responsibility. So master gardeners share their love of and interest in and their knowledge of horticulture and really help extend the reach of the agents in each county by helping answer questions. Sometimes they do that through hotlines or email or programs. And they also go out into the community and do work with civic groups and youth groups to share resources with those groups as well, because the county agents can't be everywhere. And in fact, this last year in 2019, we recorded nearly 100,000 hours of service from our over 1,200 Extension Master Gardeners across the state of Kansas.
Wow.
And the value of that volunteer hours is, I think it was $2.6 million, which is the equivalent of 48 full-time extension staff. And so their service to our organization and our state is incredible, and we really value them.
They are an invaluable resource in so many ways, but these individuals do have to go through the formal training, and that next opportunity for said training will be starting relatively soon, you say.
That's right. So it is going to differ by county, and if you're interested in it, we encourage you to contact your local office to make sure you know how they are going to handle it. But from the state level, for the very first time, we're going to offer an online version of the training. Now, we do have several things in the works. We're working on a course that could be taken anytime. But right now, what we're offering is a synchronous, which is live at the same time session. And some offices that are doing hybrid, sort of their traditional way of doing that is 1 day a week, 2 3-hour sessions in 1 day. So it's a full day of training. We have broken this out so that it takes a little bit longer and it's less time at any given time. So it'll start September 3rd, and I need registration information before that. So you'll want to talk with your local office for application information. But we'll go September 3rd through December 17th, and it'll be Thursday afternoons from 1 to 3, and it will be recorded. But it'll be up to your county to know whether or not you'll be able to watch it at a different time and still count it as participation towards earning your Master Gardener certificate. But most of them have been really reasonable about that. So I think that can potentially be expected, and they will be recorded. So we're working on lots of ways for people to access this basic training.
Excellent. If you could, as far as the subject matter, Cheryl, give us a quick rundown of the topics that will be covered at each of these Thursday afternoon sessions.
Sure. So one advantage to doing this statewide online version is that we can make sure that the folks that participate that way can really go through a progression of what makes sense so that everything sort of comes in an order that helps you understand how they connect to each other. So we're going to start with, well, the first day will be a big welcome and orientation. Then we'll have plant growth and development, soils, turf grass in Kansas, annual and perennial flowers, landscape maintenance, woody ornamentals, vegetable gardening, insects and entomology, pesticide use and safety, plant diseases, fruit in Kansas, landscape design, wildlife management, and then we will end with a virtual ceremony and celebration.
And providing the training expertise from Kansas State University and associated folk that really know their stuff in each of those areas.
That's right. We do have several specialists who are delivering training, and we also have some agents who have special expertise in certain areas that are helping cover some of those other topics. So it's truly a statewide team effort, and many of you will be able to see your local agent delivering content in this program.
So as far as taking part as a potential Master Gardener, what need one do? Is there a fee associated, anything of that ilk?
So there are some expectations and fees, and those differ depending on what county you're in. We do have a base level of participation cost, and that's $45. And then local counties usually have some other fees that include things like a name tag and a t-shirt. You will get a certificate as well, so it varies by county. So you'll need to touch base with the local extension office, and if you still have questions, they'll have answers for you pretty quickly. We're excited to have as many people as possible join us this year. There's plenty of room in our online learning environment, and we look forward to participating with each of you as you consider this as an excellent volunteer opportunity for your life.
And what we're talking about here, Extension Master Gardener Training, coming up starting with the first of multiple sessions on Thursday, September the 3rd. If this interests you, by all means, pursue it right away through your local Extension personnel, and they can give you full guidance on this. Cheryl, thanks as always. We appreciate your time and your input.
You're welcome.
Cheryl Boyer, Nursery Crop Production and Marketing Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Cheryl joining us on this week's horticulture segment. And once again, our time is away for another edition. We appreciate you tuning in and hope you'll be right back here with us this same time tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.